Hello, welcome everyone to another edition of Tenchi Securities one-on-one series. Today we're going to be doing this in English because we have a very distinguished guest, Mr. Robert Martin. Robert Martin is a senior principal software and supply chain assurance engineer at the MITRE Corporation, where he has dedicated his career to solving some of the world's most difficult problems in systems engineering. We're going to be talking today about System of Trust, which is a new framework from MITRE that Bob is leading. So without further ado, hello, Bob. Happy to have you here.
Hi there.
Awesome. Thank you for being part of our webinar and indulging and helping us learn more about System of Trust. We are very interested in anything related to third-party cyber risk management and supply chain security. So I think our audience will be very intrigued and to learn more about the framework. But before we begin, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you ended up interested in such a specific subject?
Well, so I've been at MITRE, which is the company I work for, just 42 years, a good start. But I've had many areas of focus over those years, starting in system engineering, then getting into software and reviewing software, figuring out why software can go wrong. And then I took a little divergence into the year 2000 problem for 6 years. But then it evolved into security and cybersecurity. And that journey into that area eventually came back to assurance about security. And then assurance about security evolved to supply chain issues. And so that was my background. And then one day I got a phone call from an unknown number. Turned out it was a colleague at MITRE who was being asked for a research idea. And he proposed a topic about a framework around supply chain and said, is that something you think you could tackle? And so that's what I've been doing the last 4 years.
Nice, but wait, there's very shocking news that you just broke there. Software can go wrong?
Yes. If it doesn't go wrong, it's a surprise.
Right? There's this big question about whether vulnerabilities are sparse or dense. I'm on the dense side of the equation myself.
If you haven't been paying attention to them as you develop the software, that's definitely a most likely outcome.
Yes. And for the folks listening to us that have been living under a rock for the past, 5 years and haven't heard, for example, of MITRE ATT&CK, can you tell us a little bit more about MITRE, what it is, what it does,
Sure.
what its goals are?
So MITRE is a not-for-profit corporation, and we primarily run what are called federally funded research and development centers. Basically, they're think tanks for specific parts of the U.S. government. And that can be our Department of Homeland Security, our Federal Aviation Administration, the IRS, Treasury, the DoD. We have many of them over the years. Some come and some go, but most of them are long-term engagements. And one of the things that motivates is us to be engaged with industry, because government can't solve these problems alone. And so we need to be aware of what industry is doing, what they could do, what their concerns are. And so I do a lot of my work through engagement with industry. And so that's one of the aspects. A lot of other people at MITRE are kind of in the back room with projects in the government, trying to help them manage those technology problems.
So it's interesting that when we see the kind of research MITRE generates, they're not being performed in a vacuum, right? So they're being created to address the needs of a very important constituency, and I would say one that is very sensitive to information security matters, for example, right?
Yep. Well, and in the case of many of our customers, they're also very interested in critical infrastructure and those who perform those functions or deliver those capabilities, which quickly goes into industrial capabilities.
No, it makes perfect sense, which is why it's one of the reasons why we see such solid research over the years coming out of MITRE, right? When you do publish things.
Well, and the other thing is MITRE, we can't compete for contracts. So we only are sole sourced to the government for these kinds of activities. And so we can work with anyone in industry, and they know that what we learn from them is not going to be used to compete with them.
That makes perfect sense. Creates a safe space to exchange ideas and talk openly about the problems. That's really cool. And so, tell us more about System of Trust itself, right? What are its goals? What's the intended audience? And how does it actually work? What are the moving parts involved with System of Trust?
Okay. So I'm going to actually make use of the slide here that, so basically, System of Trust is meant to be a strategic starting place for anyone who's considering to manage some supply chain risk. And so we've been basically vacuuming up everything we can find from anyone we can talk to about risks that they see in the supply chain, whether that be from the supplier, the item of supply, or the service. And we've been organizing this and trying to harmonize the terminology. And, that's a huge effort. But if that's all we did, we totally fail in System of Trust, because what you need to also be able to do is make this practical. So there's also this idea, we call it profile, where you then go into this starting place, this overall set of the supply chain risks you may need to assess, and you identify those you're actually going to use for a particular decision or that are appropriate to your business area, your technology, and then make it reflect your risk appetite and so on. So, starting with that kind of premise, and as you may have guessed, we put it together around supply, service, and the supplier. We actually have identified 14 top level risk areas that address those three topics. And we don't think you can actually combine these. So you won't be seeing us talking about, the supply chain risk is a 7. We'll be talking about either all 14 of these or whatever subset you decided was needed for a particular decision. But these are just very high level categories. And if you squint, you can see there's an RC and a number in front of these titles. And so these are meant to be the groupings, the top level groupings. In fact, these are the ones that anyone on any board, any officer of a company should know. And if there's something missing, we want to know about that. But then you get down into, what are the risks to financial stability? Well, then it gets into short-term risk, long-term obligations, the market, and your ability to steward the finances. So that, again, though, those are still categories. So this is going to go down another level or a couple until you get into something you can actually measure. So other examples, here's in the security of the organization, and that gets everything from, personnel security, the cybersecurity, environmental issues. Then you get into their effectiveness, and this sometimes we'll get into where are they located, and under, what threats are they? That could be, from a tsunami, or it could be from a government that doesn't honor intellectual property. All of these are types of different risks. Then you get into the law type of issues. Are they ethical? Are they under scrutiny for practices, whatever? Then something like external influences. And this, we've tried to make this very neutral. We're still working on that as to not being US centric, because our goal for this is every enterprise around the world, because they all can be in your supply chain. And this should be able to be positioned so the risks can be discussed, and then you put the spin on it from your perspective. So you'll hear here in our material, from countries of concern. Well, that's not a set list. So depending where you are, you'll have a different set of countries listed in there. And I think we still have a little bit of work to do on that, but we're getting there. So when you look at that, you may want to look at it, the top 3 levels. Kind of looks like the attack framework and its structure. I just walked you through these 5, but it's actually deeper than that, because these are still pretty high level categories. So when you look at the whole collection where we are, it actually can go down 7 levels till you get to the point where you're getting data and you're going to then evaluate a specific risk. So to sum it up, we have this taxonomy, this vocabulary. We've actually built it on top of a data model, and that data model is being used by a content management framework, a tool, a prototype that we use to build the content and manage it. And the important part here is, remember I said we need to get a subset to actually use it. So this has to be a dynamically managed list. So you can't just, send somebody a PDF, because how do they then pull out a subset? And how do they make sure that when you take the great grandparent and connect it to the great grandchild, that it still makes sense? And so that's a big part of our content management tool. We call it the risk model manager. And so we've been, then when you have that profile, you can export it into a spreadsheet, which you think of it as just a very structured questionnaire that you can then assess and answer the questions. And then we've been doing a lot of piloting, and I kind of already foreshadowed this, but we've been looking at how to look at the results. That middle one, we're not doing that. We're not going to come up with a single number for things, because if you have some real moderate to decent, areas, and then one that's really bad, you don't want to average that out. You need to know that that's a bad, addressable risk. It may be a showstopper. It may be that's it. The discussion's over about using that supply or that supplier. So we need things like the spider diagram, or some way of having visibility into all those, things that are risky. So summarize it. We have this data model. We're building system of trust with it. It's a taxonomy of the risks from services, suppliers, and supplies. And you come into it with a specific context, a situation your organization is looking to address. That gives you a subset, and you assess with that. If you have a different context, you have a different subset, and then you have a different basis for assessment. So that's pretty much the swing of that.
That's a very succinct way of describing something that is truly very complex, right? I was about to bring out my magnifying glass to look at that mind map you showed. Yes. And then for each of those items.
On our website, there is a copy of that, and it's SVG, so you can go all the way.
We can zoom in. So okay, so it's not just ChatGPT generated text.
Yeah.
Nice. So the first thing, I really like this approach because you're coming from the top down, and you're trying to be holistic about the supply chain, right? And we're going to talk about this a little further on, but I really hate how the supply chain security term has been hijacked by software supply chain security,
Yes.
as if only software supply chains existed, right? So, supply chain has been a term in business language for as long as we've had
Oh,
corporations, right? So but it's like, I really like that you're talking about supplier, the thing that it's supplying, like the supply itself, and any services associated with that, because those are
well,
different
and the
ways of looking at the
services,
problem.
by the way, aren't just the services related to a supply. It could be manufacturing as a service, transportation as a service.
Sure.
It could be cloud services. So it's anything that you're not doing yourself. And so I did start with, thinking about somebody coming to service an item of supply. And then I started talking to the industry, and they said, oh no, there's a whole bunch of different risks when you outsource basically something. And
Sure.
people are totally blind to that in many
Yeah.
ways.
Exactly. We tend to, in security, be very myopic, and focus on just one part of the problem, the one we understand better. And maybe that's, break something into parts and handle each part like in
Yep.
sequence. But it can be overdone for sure. But before we dive into that, so how does an organization, so the people listening to this talk, right? So they would be typically people working in information security, or more specifically either a DPO or someone that works in third party cyber risk management, right? So they're looking at the security of their suppliers and whatever services they're providing them, or whatever products they're selling, right? Big banks, big insurance companies, on a practical level, right? And maybe this is too early in the life of system of trust for this to be like put in production. But how would one go about using it? Who would be doing what? What are the stakeholders?
Right.
What processes would that entail?
Well, so I think right now, even with its first public version, which surprisingly is called version 1.3, because we had some hiccups in getting something out and shared. But we basically have, right before Christmas, we sent out a version to a community of people that we had been identifying over the last year, and they started giving us feedback on that. And we kind of pulled some of that comment and quickly put it into a version for so that we could announce it at RSA last week, 2 weeks ago now. But basically, so one way of doing something with system of trust is just make use of that map of all these risks you may need to consider. We've talked with several organizations that have said, "My God, this is much more thorough than we've been thinking about this area. I need to study this. I need to understand it." And even some different groups in government who are very focused, had the some dozen things that they were focused on, and we took their dozen, put them in context to our framework, and then shared that with them. And now they're looking at 48 things. So, different perspectives are very useful to make sure you haven't gotten into groupthink within your team. And so we think collectively we'll get a better handle on, well, what are the risks? I mean, think of it, everyone keeps running into these black swans. Well, maybe they're not all black swans. They're things we should know. And so I think right now the best thing is to, get a copy of it, look at it, and see how it balances against what you're already doing. See if there's things we're missing, or maybe in the definitions. But we've also asked, for this active feedback, because having the set of risks, having the details, definitions is only a small part of this. What we need after that is, where do you get the data to assess those risks? So, what sources? And by the way, this is not going to all be sitting out on some website somewhere or someplace you can get a subscription. Some of these you're going to have to actually physically go and get something, talk to people, get the actual item of supply, have a lab look at it, or your people. So there's going to be a whole mixture of things there. But we need to start capturing what data do you need, what information, what insight do you need? And then the last part of it is, how do I interpret that data? How do I study it and know it's indicating a high risk or a low risk or something? Think about it like your doctor. He can tell you, follow your weight, your temperature, your blood pressure, and that can, with a couple of, if it's here and here and here, come come get an appointment, versus you're probably okay. So we need that expertise of, how do I interpret it? Not because I'm going to make everybody a supply chain risk analyst expert, but rather so that we can keep away from the dangerous parts. So yeah, you're still going to need the experts for the little details, but it'd be great if all of us could, be a little safer most of the time in dealing with our supply chain risks. So that's when we think we'll also be able to have our tool available as an open source project that people could download and use, or that they can just play with and refine their way of doing their work. Because we're not going to have this as a one place where everyone has to do the work here. We want to get these ideas effervesced out into the fabric of how people do business. The knowledge, kind of body of knowledge, we'd like to be the curators of that, at least for the time being. And then, similar to CV and some of the other things we've done, maybe it'll go to a community thing, maybe it won't. So I think that it's most of what your question was about.
No, that was a very, very interesting answer, because I'm trying to summarize all that you said, and I'm probably going to fail miserably. But the first thing is, again, much like attack, you're going to become the lingua franca, essentially, of supply chain. You have the same set of definitions of terms. That's the first thing. And then you have a clear reference to point to when you're talking about things, and it's going to help people communicate. And that's no small feat, right? Even though you said if that's all we did, it would be a failure. I don't think so, because I'm talking to people.
It would be a failure given our goals.
Okay, but it would already be like a market success in a sense, because we talk to people that do third-party cyber risk management all day, every day. Very underappreciated security function. People underestimate how many security incidents happen because of the interactions between first and third parties, and how many market dynamics are involved in making a whole ecosystem being secure, because of like market failures and information asymmetries between first and third parties. And if you let me talk about it, I'm going to spend an hour, but we're here to listen to you. But I find it interesting. So just that would be a major benefit. But you're planning to go further, because you're also, again, much like attack, you are trying to have a reasonably comprehensive mapping of the things that can go wrong with suppliers, supply, and services, right? Or that you should be aware of and check.
Well, and then the other part of this then is, people do a lot of things already. So hopefully some of those things, some of those certifications, some of those, accreditations, some of those compliance things that they're doing should map into,
Sure.
giving you insight. But if we don't understand what data you would need and how to interpret it, how can I map those things in? So that's kind of the bridge to that.
But I think a lot of organizations, because they spend so much time thinking about their own security and investing in their own security, and not that it's wrong by not any stretch of the imagination, they kind of sleepwalk into doing something around third-party cyber risk management, in my experience, and they sometimes haven't actually thought it through and having like a yardstick to measure it against. So we could be thinking about 100 things. We're currently thinking about 25 of them. Maybe we want to improve our process. Maybe not all of those 75 things that we're missing are relevant, but at least you have a chance to look at that, review it, and then make that decision. Saying,
Right.
no, this is not important to me, but I'm glad I went over it. So that helps people, again, have a common understanding of how thorough a job they're doing. Am I checking for everything? Or are there
Well,
things that I
and
forgot?
depending on the group, you can mature into that, right? You don't have to be on top of everything day
Sure.
one, but you should be doing the fundamentals. I was over in Tokyo a month or two ago, and they were talking, well, how is this going to work for small businesses? And this sounds like it's a huge burden. I offered up, if you go down to lunch at a corner, food pavilion with 3 stools, you still don't expect to get food poisoning. They have some basics that they're following. So, we need to know that at least the basics are being covered.
And just out of curiosity, I think one of the best gastronomical memories I ever have of a trip was the one time I went to Tokyo for about a week and I was unable to get bad food. Like, that place is amazing. And maybe I taste umami better than most, but it was like off the charts. Like, every place I went to was just delicious. Even like, as
Well,
you said, like
most
the
of
little
them
stall
are
with 3 stools. And
they're so small they don't refrigerate anything, so it's all fresh.
it's fantastic. Like, I had the best time ever. And actually, that link to Japan, the fact that I practice martial arts, is actually why the company is called Tenchi. It's a Japanese word meaning heaven and earth. And Zanshin, the name of our product, is a term that comes from martial arts. Is a state of mind of like relaxed alertness, right? So that we have a very Japanese inspired company here, even though Spanish citizen in Brazil. Anyway, so actually, going back to your point about the completeness, right? And I really like how System of Trust forces us to think about supplier, supply, and service. So again, we see a huge hype. We were just at RSA, right? And how many companies did you see talking about supply chain security, meaning software supply chain security,
Yeah.
right?
Well, and you got to expect that at the RSA conference.
Sure.
They're cyber centric.
And more than that, it's like, what is the buzzword du jour, right? What are we talking about this edition? Like, every RSA, you have a couple of things. Like, last year maybe it was XDR, this year it was supply chain security, meaning software supply chain security. The thing I find interesting is how people looked at, let's say, the SolarWinds incident, right? Not to name a specific company, anyone can get breached. I have no insight, and I don't want to like badmouth SolarWinds or anything, just a notorious breach that we have to discuss, right? But the SolarWinds breach, everyone got the thinking of, oh, someone gave me bad software, so now I have to thoroughly vet every piece of software I get and run it through very expensive machinery to try to guess if it's malicious or not. Or now that there was Log4j, every single solution is, let me do automated analysis or semi-automated analysis of the software itself and decide that whether it's malicious or not. And that's fine. But again, people tend to be like hyper myopic, hyper focused.
Yeah.
The SolarWinds breach, for example, people forget, started with the supplier, not the supply.
In
Right?
fact, I actually was part of a rapid paper development over the holidays when that happened. Brand new senior vice president wanted to write a paper on it, and I made sure that it was very focused on the supply chain part of it. That's the whole. So if you go out and search MITRE, and probably MITRE SBOM or supply chain or SolarWinds, you'll find this paper. But it basically tried to focus on what went wrong in that supply chain and what aren't we doing as a group that could help us know when somebody is developing software in a way that that kind of attack couldn't happen. And that's run into all kinds of activities that, weren't even on the map, I don't think, maybe in some corner. But, because getting that kind of visibility into your suppliers is not easy. It's very proprietary, but yet reproducible builds, which is something that, the computer scientists have been talking about forever, actually started to be something people were asking about. And the Linux Foundation had the SALSA initiative, which was trying to say, well, what are those things that can go wrong? And how do I gain, what do I need to know to gain assurance that they didn't happen in my supply chain? So that opened a whole kind of new conversation. But yes, you're right. A lot of people just took the bad things can come to me versus how do I figure out whether somebody's got good hygiene and good practices.
And even the SBOM itself, it's typically going to be automatically generated on the software vendor's pipeline. And what if, hypothetically, an APT group hacked your pipeline? And they can inject whatever they want, not only on the software itself, but on the SBOM as well, and make it look benign, right? So the challenge here is you cannot think exclusively about the security of the supply and completely ignore the security of the supplier. Like those things are not going to add up. There's no chance that a supplier with force, and again, I'm not saying that was the case with SolarWinds because I have no internal knowledge of their environment, but there's no way an insecure supplier could be trusted to reliably produce a secure supply or provide a secure service.
It's possible it could happen, but it's likely that it won't.
And you can't trust it, right? Because at any time, an attacker could compromise them. And even if their software was secure before, then it starts not being secure, and they won't be able to prevent it or detect it or respond to it. Because
and that's, I think, the impetus in the U.S. There was an executive order 14028 that part of it mentions the need for SBOM, but another part is the need for attestations about how the software was created. And that insight coming from the federal government, along with a lot of industry players wanting that same insight, I think is going to change the way software, at least, is created. Maybe we can get that same attention on other products.
Absolutely. Again, as you said, services are super critical as well, and they suffer from many of the same issues if the supplier doesn't have proper security, hygiene, and practices, right? So just wanted to say how refreshing it was. Like, it was one of the things that brought a big smile to my face when I saw it, because it's not getting enough attention, in my opinion, right? So it's being lost in the messaging. Also, you mentioned that system of trust, so going back to how it can be used, right? That it can be used to perform assessments of the relationship, right? And I'm not even going to say of the supplier, of the relationship, right, between like consumer and supplier. It's going to be that business relationship essentially, because you're looking at supplier, supply, and services, right? So how does one go about conducting an assessment based on system of trust? Is that something that the framework itself will prescribe, like a set of methodologies to do that? Will just point in the right direction, and then each organization decides exactly how to implement it? So tell me more about how those assessments will be made.
Okay, well, first, let me share another slide here. Basically, you know, there's a couple things that system of trust is not, and that's very important to get in, because I've had people leave a discussion and go off saying things that I don't remember saying. So maybe it was I just left it to their imagination. So one thing that it's not going to be, it's not some magical database. It's a framework. But it's also a couple other things. It's not a risk management approach. So there's a lot of good work out in the world about how to manage the different kinds of risks. So that's not what we're trying to address. What we're trying to do is complement those. So those risk management approaches usually leave empty the question of what risks should I manage? And that's where we end up with chaos, because everyone comes up with their list in a different way, with different words, with different veracity and different thought. And so what we're trying to do is put that into place. So now those risk management approaches, we hope, will be much more effective, because they'll have a consistent source of what risks do we manage. And then by doing this in a way that can be tailorable and put in where you can get the data, we think we're also, bringing the bar up a little bit. And then the last thing is there's a lot of things out there that people are already doing that's going to bring evidence to this problem space. So, for instance, in the US, if you do work with the DoD, you probably will have a DoD facility clearance, which talks about the security of the building and its alarms and the guards and all that. Well, there's similar things in industry about a certified facility, especially if it has to do with customs and things moving around. All of that information answers questions we have about certain risks. So why should you ask those questions again? If somebody has a certified facility or certified to some standard, that standard's addressing risks. Let's do those mappings, and that way it's another data source. Now, there's going to be other things you need to do, but the idea here is let's not ask people to do over and over what they've already had to do. So I think that helps a little bit in the putting into context what we're doing. Now, we do want to establish you should look for data. The question should have a repeatable way of interpreting that data, and that you should come up with how much the specific risks are weighted versus others. And then whenever you do that kind of assessment, you do it exactly the same, so that you're doing this, 5 different vendors. You don't have a different tailored assessment for the 5 vendors, because that's going to put you in a court of law when one of them isn't happy with your results. So the idea here is have it structured, have it consistent, data-driven, and repeatable. So that's our mantra.
But is that something, again, each organization is going to do, or is this something where you envision, for example, like there will be a standard, even if it's community-driven? I'm not saying you're going to pontificate from on high, but is that something like there will be like a reference set of questions, reference set of data sets, et cetera, for third-party cyber risk management based on system of trust?
There could be. I think that's the sprint and marathon phase. We're still crawling. Um, you know, I doubt MITRE would be driving that, but I think, there may be standards groups that, see this and want to leverage it for their membership in certain areas. There may be commercial offerings that want to, address this as well. I mean, there's a lot of companies that are offering insight to supply chain risks, but they tend to try to grab a lot of data and look for bad things. And the trouble is you don't know what risk questions they're actually addressing and which ones did they find an answer for versus which ones they didn't. And therefore the uncertainty. So you look at a dashboard and it shows you some reds and greens, but there's actually, no structure to it as to, well, what risk questions were they asking? Which ones did they actually get measurement for? And which ones are still unknown? So that's another thing in our system of trust would be, if you don't know some of the questions, then that particular aspect of risk could be none, or it could be the world is falling apart. And you have to leave that uncertainty into your risk assessment until you can get some data or put in mitigations for it. And so that's so I think it's going to be interesting to see how people adopt and adapt system of trust thinking to what they're trying to do. I mean, there's a lot of energy out there, so we're not going to be able to replace it.
Sure, that's pretty interesting. So essentially, you could use this with whatever risk management methodology you already are familiar with. It's just, again, mapping what risks there are, again, that common taxonomy, that common terminology, and having the associated body of knowledge to understand what those mean, what kind of supporting data to look for. But then each organization, each tool will probably find inventive ways of applying that to their specific use case and to their specific scenario. But I agree with the standardization. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's what we're expecting is, if you look at our other areas that we've worked, you couldn't foretell some of the things people are doing with it now. And so we're trying to, kind of restructure a problem area. But, we're just trying to get it to a more tractable starting place and then let the market and industry and government needs drive it to a new place.
Right. That's awesome. I just love this. We're going to have a hard time. We're 40 minutes in. We're going to have a hard time not being 2 hours on this because I could talk about this all day. So the next question I have is, one of the big challenges I often hear from third-party cyber risk management people is, how do I communicate risk? Assuming I have a good grasp of what the risk is associated with a relationship with a third party, how do I communicate? How do I measure? How do I compare risk? So we typically see two big problems people want to solve when they measure risk. I call them the stall to ride problem and the comparison problem. So again, if a supplier, the first problem, you must be the stall to ride. So anyone that doesn't have a minimum, for whatever definition of minimum amount of hygiene, I don't even want to work with the third party. So they either get their act together or they're not even have a contract with me. Right. And then there's this other problem. There is the comparison problem where I have finite resources on my third-party cyber risk management organization, and I want to know what to focus on, right? So if I have an idea of where the most risk is, I can focus my efforts on that. So it's a prioritization problem, essentially. And one of the things I find interesting about the goals of system of trust is that you mentioned that you want to be able to use a set of contextually driven, tailorable weight measurements to be able to score risk, right? It's listed on the website as one of the goals of the framework. So how do you envision that? Again, this might be related to the previous question where it's going to be flexible and people can apply it in different ways, but what's your current thinking on how to measure that?
So I'm going to again go to a couple of slides because this is actually a pretty deep area. So, oops.
You, sir, came prepared.
I did. Well, and it may be that I've talked to a lot of people and had a lot of these questions in different ways come up. And some of those discussions, by the way, have not been with just industry, but with different committees of our congressional offices here, which is not a normal place for MITRE to be talking, but they're very concerned about the consistency and thoroughness and repeatability of decision making. And so if we look at where we left this our taxonomy, we had this example with wonderful colors. So if you think about these colors, so I left you at these are all categories. So to actually measure, you need to get down to something that's a risk factor. And so basically, here's an example. So at the very top, there's still RC76. That's the one that was on the previous slide. But if you go through two more risk categories down to risk factor 520, that's external cybersecurity incidents. So that's an actual measurable thing. So we have a description of it, a definition rather, and then we also are putting in ideas of where you can get that data. So these happen to be available online. And so then the last part is, well, okay, I got the data, but it is 3 incidents in the last 2 years good, bad, indifferent? What is it? So we need to have risk measures that actually come up and say, how many or, how to calculate something that indicates the high, medium, or low in this case. And so just as an example, we actually did some piloting I mentioned, and we looked at a company and we found 4 issues. And according to this measurement approach, they would be considered high risk in this area. So now we have a kind of a good hygiene assessment of a company that looked at a couple different areas. So that was one. Another would be looking at supplier has mergers and acquisitions restructuring. So you can see here, it's only one additional risk category down from the top before you can get to that measurable area. It's got a definition, a rationale. It's got sources of data, and then again, a rubric for how to interpret that data. In this case, the 8 mergers and acquisitions in the last 5 years is only moderate risk, because that's a very normal thing in many businesses. Another one we could look at is key management and personnel being involved in lawsuits or the company itself. And here, again, looking, we found in a couple websites that they were over 4 in the time period. And so that's high according to industry standards in this area. And then the last one was about, is it wholly owned? And here, this time, this one still needs to be twisted because it's US centric in its current writing, but you could easily morph this into something that's not. But here, from our point of view, it was low risk because of the it's wholly owned U.S. So you do this kind of setup of a question, where you're going to get the data, how you're going to interpret it, and you can come up with some representation like this. And so those findings I just showed you are part of the 25 risk factors that we assessed in these these 6 of the 7 supplier areas. So this is just an example. If I was going to do this for a real, customer for a real project, these risks would mean something to that project, and they would decide whether these were mitigatable or whether they were just, oh my God, I can't deal with this. And so this is the general approach we're looking at. So stepping back a little bit, it's that we have this catalog of risks. They're all potential risks, right? They're things you want to evaluate. And so that risk factor, which is the thing that's measurable, well, what are the measurements? And you could be measuring for good things, or you could be measuring for bad things. And you want to sum those up as to how much of a risk this particular area is. So you need data, you need information. And the information that a lot of people immediately fixate on is websites, public websites or services, Bureau van Dijk, Exeter, Interos, Treasury, State Department. There's lots of different places you can find data. And I was just talking about, you could also go out and look at standards. I talked about that, where, you figure out which risks are addressed by it. There's a lot of standards out there, so that's going to take us a little while. But so you could basically think of those as being another way of getting answers to whether those risks occur or not. But there's things more that you could look at. You could look at, actual product level testing. Here, it's an example of software, but you could think the same thing in the meat industry. There's standards that they have, tests that they do. And then there's also, hey, you can go directly, talk to the vendor, talk to the supplier, site visits, and so on. So that's kind of where we think these different things are going to come together. And the way in our risk model manager we've showing this is we actually list data sources, and then we map from a data source to which of the risk questions they can answer. And so when you actually go in and do an assessment, and we've got this prototype of an assessment mode that it actually identifies, okay, which data sources have been identified for this risk question, pick one, and you can go in and do the assessment. So we want to give that kind of suggestions, and we're open. I'm fine if there's 56 different ways of answering this question. Right now, most people are probably scratching their head about one. And so, if commercial offers want to help us, put in, hey, I can help you answer that question, that's perfect. So that's the end of my slides, but I think
No, that really answers the question. And so do you plan on rolling up? Because I see you're very clear, and I love it, about, again, like a qualitative, for each risk factor, if it's medium, low, medium, or high, which is simple enough to understand. It's enough to base decisions on. And you made a reference just now, which I think is actually something I also believe in, and it's a little bit controversial. Some companies are trying to get it all to a number or to a letter, right? And I think that's really reductionist in a sense, because security is so complex. It's the kind of decision no one would dare to make based on a single number, right? Even if you talk about credit scores, for example, Like banks don't just look at your credit score and decide whether to give you credit or not. They will look at a ton of other info about you, more detailed, and
well,
no one does an M&A.
Yeah, the reductionist, as you said, it's too simplified. It's not letting the person who's trying to make a decision understand the context, the way they, if I had a dashboard and I could go play around with each of the factors and the weights, and I could adjust the criteria to my decision making, maybe I could get a score. But that's not something somebody else could do for me. It's not something that, I can understand the drive to that because people want to make it simple. And it may be safe to do that, but you're also probably costing yourself opportunities because you're eliminating people that are organizations that are probably fine, but because somebody's rubric scored them, harshly, they're out. And there could be the other side of it is that they could have missed some risks that you would never let a deal go through with being on the table.
Exactly. So you have, especially when you have bounded, you're trying to summarize everything into a number that has like upper and lower limits. Like, how can you bound risk? Right. I don't think risk is bound.
Well, it depends on your sensitivity. Some people are very numb to risk. Either that or they're just blissfully ignorant. They just whistle through the dark, right? They don't know about the ogres and the bears.
But they're there.
They're there.
My grandmother, the old Spanish lady, had a saying, "No creo en brujas, pero que las hay, las hay." I don't believe in witches, but they do exist. So it's like this weird saying that actually makes you scratch your head. But actually, like, you have to be careful. You need to be aware of things, even if you don't want to. Essentially, right? Not that witches particularly do exist, but that's the thinking behind this. So I really like the idea of having the details, of giving people context to make decisions, because that's how people make decisions, especially business people, right? No one does a merger and acquisition and says, I need a precise estimation of the percentage that this M&A will not be successful in giving us this much return. Like, people are going to make decisions on qualitative and incomplete information all the time, as long as they have enough context and they have enough data points to gain confidence that they're making the right decision, right? And I see people trying to summarize things into dollar amounts without a solid foundation behind this, things that are very subjective, or a single number that doesn't even represent risk. So we see a lot of products that generate scores, and they're being used incorrectly because they don't even represent risk. They represent security posture. And so the same company with the same security posture could represent tremendously different amounts of risk for different first parties, depending on how they're using them, right? So it's refreshing at a minimum to see the approach you guys are taking, and so this is more a comment than a question. But I just wanted to say how happy I am about this. What about rolling up? Do you have any suggestions or any ideas on like visualizing this and rolling up those individual risk factors? That's probably what the attack-like map represents, right? So you're going to be perhaps color coding the different squares depending on whether you have high risk.
Right now, that is one possible way. What we've found is that the spider diagram and a couple levels of spider diagrams may be one useful way. So, show the summary at the top level. If somebody says, well, what's this? You could go then look below it at its composition and get down to the actual driving issue. The idea is to make it available for the decision maker, and make sure that it's a data driven. Those are the, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of things to discuss as we get deeper into this, but right now the spider diagram is the one that we seem to find easiest to use as a conveyance to decision makers.
Nice. Bob, again, I could do this all day, but we're hitting the 1 hour mark. So I would ask you if you have any final remarks. And in particular, I would love for you to tell the folks listening here, because I'm pretty sure a lot of people listening to this webinar will be interested in learning more and perhaps even contributing to System of Trust. You talked about people providing feedback. So where do they go? How do they reach you or MITRE? How do they submit feedback? And we're going to add contact information, links to the show notes later, right? As well. So okay. You can see this.
Well, I have one last slide if you want to share it. Basically, our website and an email address and a couple of papers that we have up describing System of Trust. If people don't, want to get into the going through the whole site. The other thing that they can do and they'll find on the website is that we have one page about the risk model manager. And if you look at the menu, you can actually register to get an account. And so that will let you go look at the content. You can work through the hierarchy, get down to the measures, and start to look at the details. There's a lot of details there. And we're, people who have been doing this have been giving us feedback. If your organization's interested, just email the SOT@mitre.org. And we have a community page of those who have, said, yeah, I want to help, and here's some help, and sure, I can be acknowledged on that page.
And we are very proud to be on that page, and we're going to do our best to help in any way we can. I truly believe in the work you guys are doing. Thank you so much for doing this work and helping push the industry forward. Thanks in particular for being here today and spending your time with us. This was pretty great, and look forward to talking to you some more, and look forward to meeting all of you viewers on our next Tenchi 101. Bye-bye.
Thank you.